Hello, I'm Barry Forshaw. I'm a writer on crime fiction and film. I've written for most of the national newspapers, currently the Financial Times and the Eye, but I've written for the Guardian, the Times and the Express. And this is another of my whistle-stop tours through my book, Crime Fiction: The Reader's Guide. This week, the 5 minutes, very brief, very pithy, hopefully, is about Private Eyes and Gumshoes. You might wonder why Philip Marlowe and Sam Spade and a lot of other people won't feature in this, because they come in other sections. The last time I did this, I talked about Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, but this is about just 4 or 5 key private eye figures. I'm going to start with a man who many people consider to be the best current writer of crime fiction in the world. Not everyone agrees, but that's the American James Lee Burke. I was once deputized to try to bring him to the UK for an event, and he was not having any of it. He doesn't travel, but his work travels. His books are massive, state-of-the-nation novels, like all the best detective fiction. Dennis Lehane, who we'll also get back to, he's energized by things in society, and those are the things that power his book, that power his work. I wrote about James Lee Burke. One of the most distinctive crime-cracking protagonists on the scene is James Lee Burke's quick-witted gumshoe, Dave Robicheaux. And The Neon Rain, 1987, was a perfect calling card for an accomplished new writer. He's a really interesting writer. The use of language is very assured and very, very committed. Robicheaux is a marvelous character. There's an interesting story I have about this, and I suppose I can reveal it now because it's a while since I've been a CWA Dagger judge. But during a discussion over one of his books, which is up for prize, there was dissent. And the dissent was based over the fact that Robicheaux and his character is about a seeking for grace, a seeking for religious grace, which is something which is very much a part of James Lee Burke himself. People didn't like that. His wife is an ex-nun, and somebody did say to me, yes, she gives him both sex and grace, and that's just too easy. Well, that doesn't worry me. And I speak as someone who's always loved Graham Greene, so I don't mind the religious strand getting in the way, even though it's very strange coming from a man who is as angry as James Lee Burke is. He was as angry about the last president, not Obama, his predecessor, as he is about the new one. I would move on from James Lee Burke quite quickly to another great American writer called Michael Connelly. Michael Connelly, people would say, is possibly the best current writer, the best practitioner of crime fiction and detective fiction at the moment. People who know him know about his characters, and he's done something quite clever. He's got 3 separate franchises running. We will all know about the fact that Mickey Haller, the Lincoln lawyer, is a character who was introduced fairly late, because by then we've become accustomed to Harry Bosch, his LA cop. And recently he's introduced a 3rd character, a female character, Rennie Ballard. In a way, it's a slight shame that the Ballard introduction has to involve her being sexually harassed. The day will come when Black writers don't have to deal with race, and women cops don't have to deal with sexual harassment. And that will surely be the day that we need to aspire to. In a way, it was kind of like when Sidney Poitier had to always play fairly noble characters when he was the leading Black actor. His characters could have only the most minor moral blemishes. Even when he made a film of Porgy and Bess, he insisted that Porgy no longer be a beggar as he is in the opera. That had to be changed. When now we can have Black characters who can be all across the whole moral spectrum, that's the way it should be. And that was all a bit of a diversion. But Rennie Ballard is still a wonderful character, even though she's dealing with the fact that she is on the late shift because she was demoted after complaining about sexual harassment. I'd recommend almost anything by Michael Connelly, but The Gods of Guilt is the one I discuss in this. A writer I met a few times, is unfortunately no longer with us, is Sue Grafton. Sue Grafton, who unfortunately died before she could finish her alphabetical sequence of novels. Those books, the Kinsey Mill Home books, are Slightly formulaic, one has to say. She was getting through the alphabet, and you wouldn't necessarily pick out any one book in the sequence as being better than the others. But they're extremely well written, and Kinsey was a wonderfully rounded character. It was a shame, in a way, that that she didn't get to the end of the sequence. Probably a more substantial and a more important writer, and many people's favorite woman writer, is Sara Paretsky. And V.I. Warshawski is probably the leading female gumshoe in the genre. As I mentioned about James Lee Burke, these books are powered by anger at social injustice, anger about the system which does people down. There is certainly a feminist strand in the book, but it's not an anti-male feminist strand. The books are not like, say, Marilyn French's The Woman's Room, where the whole agenda is about the awfulness of the male sex. That's not Sara Paretsky is going into. There's an awful lot of awful males in her books, but that's not what the books are about. Basically, she's doing quite a clever balancing act, which a lot of female writers with female protagonists have to do, which is to make it feasible and plausible that their female detectives could survive in a violent world. She persuades one of that with total persuasiveness, shall we say. I'm on to Dennis Lehane. He's a particular favorite of mine. I wrote about Dennis and Prayers for Rain. With a background as a counselor specializing in disturbed and abused children, Lehane writes with authority. His Mystic River, 2001 film by Clint Eastwood, vaulted him into the star stream, but his Kenzie Gennaro novels, beginning with A Drink Before the War, established a firm basis for his growing reputation. So Boston private investigator Patrick Kenzie is the character in Lehane. Again, I'm sorry to have to keep using this phrase, state of the nation novels, but that's what Dennis writes. He writes novels which are extremely ambitious, which have a very wide cinemascope panoply of America and generational. They're also about the effects of generation on succeeding generations. And that brings me to one of my particular favorites. And the man who I would say is possibly, and I know it's controversial to say this, the best writer of detective stories in America throughout history. And I'm including Dashiell Hammett, and I'm including Raymond Chandler, and that's Russ MacDonald, Kenneth Miller. I wrote in Crime Fiction, The Reader's Guide, the notion of a holy trinity of American masters of the private eye novel was somewhat slow in coming. While Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett had long enjoyed exalted status, the reputation of Kenneth Miller, better known as Russ MacDonald, was slower in coming. The wait was worthwhile, and whisper it. There are even many fans of the genre who would consider MacDonald to be the finest writer the field has known. Like Graham Greene, Russ MacDonald utilizes the form to write what might be described as literary fiction. Certainly, these are novels of character. They're novels in which I said when talking about Chandler that the source of wrongdoing, evil, malfeasance was usually women. In Russ MacDonald, it's usually fathers. It's a generational thing. It's always chercher le père in Russ MacDonald. The books are all wonderful. There's a great many of them, which slightly puts people off. But possibly his own favorite is one that one should read, which is The Galton Case, which is his own favorite. I can't not mention, because this has to be very brief, and this is only a handful of the people who are in the book, the great George Pelecanos with his black detective, Derek Strange. And guess what? George Pelecanos is very much a writer who writes about the state of his country. If anybody's seen The Wire, they will see how he and David Simon put together this amazing Zola-esque panoply of America, incredibly ambitious, using tangentially, if you like, the crime format, but being much more ambitious. The Deuce, the more recent series by the team, was less successful, but still had that sharp edge when dealing about the pornography industry that had been found in The Wire. Pelecanos' books are full of rage, full of passion, but beautifully written. And I'm going to end with just something totally off the wall, and that's a British writer, Cathy Unsworth, and her book Weirdo. This is actually detective fiction, and Kathy is a writer who is quite unlike almost anyone else you've read. There's almost no describing her books. They're informed by her love of older culture, if you like, of jazz and punk. Her sensibility is somewhere between, I don't know, Billie Holiday and Johnny Rotten. She doesn't read like anyone else, but she still uses the crime format. That is only a handful of the people who are in the privatized chapter. And I hope you'll take a look at the book and look at who the others are. And I'll be back shortly with another chapter.